It's springtime, riders, and for most of us, that means it's track season. However, there's nothing worse than going to the track and getting stuffed up the inside like you just seen right here. Now, I don't know the situation here, but clearly somebody's in the wrong group. And for some of you who race, you might say, hey, that was a clean line, he took an opportunity. But for track days, that really sucks. And I've been on the receiving end, and I've also, just like many of you, I've been on the other end where I've made some shady, maybe not so great passes myself. So today, we're gonna get with Nick, and he's gonna show you some really good passes and also some bad passes down at Indy Motorsports Ranch. Now, for a lot of us, passing can be either a ton of fun or it can be one of our biggest fears when going to the track. So let's take a look and see how we can come away from our track day having a good, enjoyable experience and leaving the same way that we showed up. Let's go.
Riders, for the next few minutes, let's take a look at 6 runs through this corner. The first 3 will be safe and smart and not surprise or scare anyone. The second group of 3 will be a little bit edgy, leading into what can be very, very bad. This is Indy Motorsports Ranch turn 6, and we describe this as a balanced type corner. In other words, the time under braking right here going into the corner is very similar to the time under acceleration coming off the corner. And that's called a balanced corner, and it's a great corner to make a pass in. You can kind of rush into the corner on an inside pass and hurt your exit, still have a pretty good time, or get the bike in, slowed, turned on the entry, and have a strong exit. Good split time either way. So nice place to play with your passing. And what we've got here, this first one is our slow rider, and the slow rider has a couple of responsibilities. They will be online as close as possible. They'll be smooth. They will not look over their shoulders. They will always have their focus head. Control riders and coaches, we are going to work very hard with newer riders to get them online. It makes them predictable is really what we're looking for. And getting them online is huge, and you'll see the slower rider in the next 6 run-throughs does a great job. The faster rider here in yellow will be the passing rider, and we'll show them making inside-outside passes, good and bad. So let's take a look here at the first pass. This is a very good inside pass. As the slower rider approaches the corner in a straight line, the faster rider makes that pass before the slower rider turns in. That's a very safe pass. They're in the peripheral vision of the slower rider before the slower rider turns in. The slower rider will turn in somewhere in this area. At that point, this pass closes, but the yellow rider sees it and does a good job. Riders, this might be a pass the yellow rider saw the previous lap, couldn't take advantage of it then, saw it a little bit too late, but thought, okay, next lap, I'll pass that rider before they turn in. And it's very safe, easy to do, super smart, doesn't scare anybody. The yellow rider thinks somewhere at this corner entry, he remembers radius equals miles per hour. That inside pass, that block pass, will tighten your radius into the corner. You just have to think, I've got to use my brakes a little bit more, a little bit longer to get the bike down on apex, which the yellow rider, the slower rider, do a good job of. Second pass through. This is a good outside pass, and you'll hear that, outside passing only. We'll get into why that is not the best advice, but in this case, yellow rider passing a slower rider, it works very well, because yellow rider gets it done before this point right here where my arrow is. This is a point at which somewhere in here the slower rider is allowed to start to exit off the corner and run right out to the curbing on the left. That's the fastest, safest line, and the slower rider is allowed to use that line. And you'll see what the yellow rider does here. The faster rider gets around, the slower rider gets back into their peripheral vision. Very safe outside pass, no problem at all. And you can imagine, I hope what you're thinking is, the outside pass will not work on someone running very similar speeds to you without being a little bit hairball, because you're running a wider radius, having to get the bike down on apex. We'll see how they do. Great job. You can see the slower rider running right out to the curbing, but the yellow rider had the pass done, no problem. On this third pass, right in here, the yellow rider might think, I'll go around the outside of the slower rider. But the slower rider gets into the corner surprisingly well, so the yellow rider can't get around the outside. So right in here, this is key. This spot right here is key, because the yellow rider will make a pass on the right-hand side of the slower rider as the slower rider stands their bike up off the corner. As the slower rider stands their bike up to the left of the racetrack, yellow rider will pass them on the right side, parallel with, or in this case, going away from. The reason this spot here is key, because the faster rider must slow the bike here and allow this slower rider to clear this apex, and that's the way to think about it, clear the apex. If the yellow rider comes right up behind the slower rider, it becomes a drag race from the apex to the next braking zone somewhere down here. So this idea that the yellow rider checks up and says, okay, let that rider clear that apex, so the rider moves off the apex, clears it, and now that opens up that nice strong exit for the yellow rider by letting that bike slow. Let's take a look. Beautiful. The yellow rider lets their bike point a little bit better. Of course, if your bike is pointed a little bit better or a little bit later in the corner, you can stand the bike up quicker. If you can stand the bike up quicker, you can accelerate harder, all things being equal. Very nice pass. Couldn't make it on the outside. Let the bike turn and pass the rider on the inside on the exit, going away from. Very nice. Let's look at our fourth time through and our first kind of a bad one. And we'll just show this. This happens a lot. It's easy to do. And what happens is this inside pass is a little bit too late. We know it's too late because the slow rider begins to turn into the corner. Slow rider's turning into the corner at this point. They're turning in, they're coming to the right, and this yellow rider is on that inside passing line and leaves it in. What the yellow rider does really well is gives the slow rider a lot of room. That was really good. Well done. Realizing radius is mile an hour, leave it on the bottom. Try to get in that rider's peripheral vision before they really come down, but that is a little bit of a late pass due to the fact that the slow rider is turning to the right. At this point, yellow riders, if you make this mistake, take your left hand off that handlebar and give them a nice wave. Give that slow rider a wave, saying, sorry about that, my timing wasn't quite right. That one gave the slow rider quite a bit of room, but you can imagine if it was closer, it's pretty upsetting. The rider had already turned into the corner, and then the yellow rider appeared. They were coming toward each other. And even with that much distance, it's still scary for a new rider. So, parallel with or going away from. Let's look at our fifth time through, our second kind of a bad one. And this is just outside pass, and it's okay, but it's still a little bit late, and we'll tell you why. At this point, you think, no, the yellow rider's okay. They're ahead of the slower rider, but riders got to keep in mind, what's the slow rider's body position? They're fully hung off to the inside. Their head is down. They're starting to drop their head on the exit. Their eyes are looking through this apex to this exit. They may not physically be able to see this rider in their peripheral vision because their vision is blocked by the gas tank and the fairing and the handlebars and the triple clamp because they're hanging off to the right. So this is a problem, and we get away with it here, but it's a lot closer than we want to see. In our belief, if you think about the body position of the slower rider, the faster rider is still not in their vision. And just by the good luck that the slow rider is not on a very fast bike that opens radius really, really fast and just drives out here, because that's what we'll see on the next one. This one we get away with it, but it's closer than we want, but this is the one that we see on track days. At this point, this pass is not doable. Why? Because as we go a little bit further, that slow rider is going to start to stand their bike up. They are going to stand their bike up to this curbing. And the only hope the yellow rider has is they don't stand the bike up, because they are not in their peripheral vision yet. Let's take a look. Gets pretty ugly right there, doesn't it? Because as the slower bike stands up, the faster bike runs their brake lever or their front tire right into the back of the slower bike. The options are this rider can run off in the dirt, lay down and say, boy, that slower rider pushed me off. Yellow rider can hope that the slower rider doesn't use all the racetrack, and riding on the racetrack with hope is not the best way to do it. This is a tough crash. This is a tough deal. Keep in mind the slow rider has no mirrors. They have no idea you're back there. They're allowed to use this racetrack. So the change here, we've got to go back. Got to go back to the point at which the yellow rider realizes this is not going to work. And this right about here. At this point, the yellow rider sees they're not going to get around. They know the slow rider is allowed to use all this racetrack on the exit. So here's what the faster rider does at this point. They've tried the outside pass, and riders, it's not going to work. They're too late. They're not around them before the acceleration zone. So at this point, the yellow rider slows their bike longer. Their radius tightens better. The apex a little bit later, and they make that nice, safe inside pass on the corner exit. Thanks for listening. Passing is huge. It can ruin newer riders' days if we're passing them too closely, passing them left, right as they come toward us. It really ruins their day. And of course, what do? They go home, they get on the forums, they say, don't do a track day with these people. They passed me too closely. They almost took me out. And of course, for those of us making passes, we need to help grow our sport with parallel with or going away from.
Yeah!